Assalamu alaikum, everybody. This is Azadeen Hawam, the founder of Sada Echoes. I'm excited to be with you today. Sada is a storytelling space rooted in listening, memory, and relationship. Through Unbounded stories bring us together, and they remind us that communities exist to remember, resist, and heal. Stories carry love across generations, hold grief with care, and open space for healing where harm has tried to settle. Today's conversation is a wonderful opportunity and a conversation dear to my heart. I am with my dear friend Karen Red. We're going to reflect on how storytelling becomes a collective act of care, accountability, and love. Now, if I start telling you about Karen, I would need a long time. But I'm going to tell you a bit about her, and I'll ask Karen to tell me more. Karen's contribution to peace, justice, and transformative education has been widely recognized here in the city and beyond. Karen has won many awards and been recognized for many things. But the one thing that I will want to share about Karen is that Karen will always listen to people and always have time for people to make sure they're okay. And that means so much to me. Karen, welcome to our chat today. Thank you for making the time to be with us. We want to start in a good way. We want to know a little more about you before diving into the questions. So welcome to Unbounded.
Thank you, Azadeen, my brother. I'm so honored by your introduction. What would you like to know about me? It's sometimes hard to know where to start.
I think people would like to know what Karen does to promote healing.
Okay. Boy, that's a big topic. So, that's been different things at different times in my life. And one of the things that people often don't know about me is that I worked as a therapeutic clown in the Children's Hospital and actually initiated the therapeutic clowning movement, which is worldwide. And that was an opportunity to support healing through psychosocial support. And it was an amazing opportunity to do that. So I'm not even sure if you knew that about me, that I was a therapeutic clown. So that's one of the ways in the past that I have done that. I've also worked as a human rights accompaniment and observer in war zones, El Salvador, Guatemala, Colombia. And more recently, I've been working in the field of teaching, which I think there's multiple ways that I support justice and healing as a teacher. One is I teach at University of Winnipeg for Canadian Mennonite University and also at the Canadian Mennonite University Grand Shaftesbury campus. I think one of the things that we do as educators is we help people find their own selves, right? We help them find who they are and find their voices. And for some people, that's an extremely healing opportunity to be able to I think you and I both work hard to make a classroom where people can say their truth, where people can arrive fully as themselves and not have to try to code themselves for the university. I think that's healing. I work in the field of peace and conflict transformation studies, and so we talk about things like racism and sexism and classism, heterosexism, Islamophobia, and bring into those spaces conversations that are desperately needed right now. I hope as a professor and teacher that I am someone who does listen. I hope I'm someone that when students are struggling, that they feel that they can come and talk to. And I hope that I try to create a classroom where all voices are present and able to be heard. So those would be some of the answers I'd give to you.
Thank you, Karen. I think this so-called clown movement you talked about, it's so beautifully and so much needed in our world today. I mean, I remember you telling me about it and I was astonished because I didn't know. But then that explains so much about you, Karen, and what you bring to people's lives. So thank you for that. And I think to seg into this conversation further, in your social work justice here locally in Winnipeg, nationally and internationally, how do you see stories being or acting as a way to restore dignity? And I'm thinking about people who historically have been told to be quiet, historically been silenced. Here with Unbounded Stories, as you are aware, we are trying to create a platform for those folks who have been told that your story don't belong here. we want to be that space where they feel like they belong. So in your world, in your work, how do you see stories restoring dignity?
So I think the first part of that answer is that I grew up in a family of storytellers. So my grandparents, my father, but it was fairly gendered. That the people who told the stories were the males in my family, and the women were more the sort of receptive audiences. And so one of the things that I see in terms of restoring dignity is my own ability to tell my story. And for me, a really transformational moment around that was when I came back from having worked in El Salvador doing human rights accompaniment with Peace Brigades International, and I'd been arrested and detained, and I came back to Canada, and I was so filled with the desperate need to speak out about what was happening in El Salvador, the repression people were facing, the fact that there were people I had been arrested with who were still incarcerated in torture centers. And in that moment, I stopped trying to speak like someone else and instead started to try to speak my own truth and my own voice. And that entirely shifted how I told stories and also how people heard stories from me. So that was a moment, I think, when I had some of my dignity restored to me, my voice to be able to tell stories. Now, in lots of ways, I'm really privileged, right? I'm white, I'm cisgendered, I'm middle class, I'm university educated. So there's, in many ways, I have spaces that other people's stories don't get to have. But having not had that space, I think, and I hope, makes me more sensitive to the fact that there are other people who currently don't get space to tell their stories. One of the aspects of the work that I do right now is that I work for a small not-for-profit CFSC, Canadian Friends Service Committee, which is the social justice arm of the Quakers. And my job there is as Transformative Justice Program Coordinator. And my role is to try to move us nationally towards a more restorative and less punitive response to harm and wrongdoing. And so I think a lot about how do we get that to happen in a society that is addicted to punitive responses to harm. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we need to hear the stories of people who've been incarcerated and how traumatizing that process is, and how they often come out in so much worse shape than when they went in, and how traumatizing that is on families, right? And I think we need to break some of the stigma that we have around people that are incarcerated. I think we dehumanize them. We often do that with groups that we quote called marginalized, right? We dehumanize. I know you've experienced that in lots of different ways. And so one of the ways that I'm trying to open space is to open space for the voices of people with lived experience of incarceration, or family members of people with lived experience of incarceration, and also people who've been harmed. I think one of the reasons that we get so fixated on vengeance as a response to harm is because we don't do well by people who've been harmed. We don't give them the support that we need. We don't give them the community that they need. And we don't give them the space to tell their stories. And often people who have been traumatized need to tell their stories as a way to make sense of that and bring together healing. And I experienced that myself when I came back from El Salvador. I had PTSD. I was traumatized by the experience of having been in a torture center. And I found one of the things that was incredibly healing was the opportunity to tell and retell and retell and retell my story. And for me, I was lucky that there was space for me to do that. I know that's not true for everybody.
Thank you, Karen. I appreciate that. And I appreciate the notion of stories as an act of love and resilience. So a lot of people say to me, especially recently, because I just got back from Palestine, what did you bring back from Palestine? And or what are you bringing back after being in Palestine, witnessing everything? And often I answer with hope, because I've seen a lot of love, despite what the media you don't see that on the media. So to center your answer and to think about it in a different way, when you came back from those places you mentioned, how did these stories help you understand the Canadian story better? Like we talk about, what, we want to do work in these places, and that's important work. We want to do it and we want to continue it. But how do we bring those experiences, those stories from El Salvador, Palestine, and other places, to strengthening our solidarities here on Turtle Island with our Indigenous brothers and sisters? I've been asking myself that question lately a lot.
So I have a number of thoughts, so you might have to bear with me here a little bit. The first is when you talk about how you come back from Palestine bringing hope. I have a very vivid memory of when I was able to spend time in Palestine with you and your family in Asmut and go to Nablus. I remember you taking me into the old market area, and we ended up in a store. You didn't know the shopkeepers, but that doesn't matter. People just invite you in. They invited us in, and of course they had to serve us coffee, which, as you know, is a challenge for me. I can't really drink that very strong coffee, yes. But I did. And we sat and we talked, and one of the things that they wanted you to make sure I heard was the hopefulness of Palestinian people and the resilience. They did not want me to take away a story of victimhood. They wanted me to take a story of utter determination and joyfulness. And they were very explicit with you that I needed to take those stories back, and the fact that the Palestinians would never stop. So when you say you brought back hope, that's immediately who I think of as those two men sitting in that shop and drinking coffee and being very explicit with you about what I needed to take back. I also think of one of the reasons I went to El Salvador in the first place. So when I was in my late teens, early 20s, one of the things that I struggled with was undiagnosed depression. And I imagine that many young people in these days struggle with looking around the world as it is and feeling hopeless about it, right? It's a pretty bleak time to be a young person. And I certainly felt that as a young person myself. And in that period of time, it's the long story, I won't tell the long story, but my father sort of stumbled into becoming aware of the struggle in El Salvador and the U.S. involvement in oppression of Salvadoran people and their freedom. And because of my father's interest in that, then we would have all these Salvadorans coming through our home and speaking about their experiences. And I remember listening to them and thinking, like, how can they be so hopeful? Like how can they? It just seemed impossible to me. And it began in me this desire to spend time in Central America, partly to support Salvadorans and Guatemalans and their struggle, and also because I knew I had something to learn. And I knew to learn some of that resilience and capacity for joy in the face of difficulty. And that was very strongly my experience in Guatemala and El Salvador. And in fact, I at one point was able to ask a Salvadoran activist about this. It was in the middle of the night. I was accompanying, so this third-party nonviolent presence, unarmed bodyguard, at the UNTS, the National Union of Salvadoran Workers. It was an office that had been bombed a couple weeks earlier. The windows were all broken out. There were sandbags in front so that if it got bombed again by the government, it would create less damage. People slept in that office because it was safer for them than going home. And they wanted a foreigner present because it made them safer to have someone like me present, which is, kind of it's unjust that, quote, first world and white privilege would make them safer with me there. But if that exists, then let's use it, right? Let's use privilege to undo the existence of privilege. So I was there with member of Peace Brigades. I was there accompanying that night. And we would stay up in the night and watch out over the street so we could warn people if the military came to put a bomb down. And I always tried to take the middle of the night shift because other people had more work to do in the daytime. And my job was really just to be present, like just to make things safer. So it was the middle of the night, but they did always want to have a Salvadoran with me, understandably, because they would know more about the situation and read the situation in better Spanish and all these things. So I was watching it with Oscar, and Oscar was the executive director of the of CODIDES. CODIDES was the Union of Unemployed and Fired Workers, which is a remarkable thing, right? Talk about a union that doesn't have a lot of power, but was very engaged. And so Oscar and I were sitting around just chatting, whatever, while we're watching out over the street. It's kind of cold, and sometimes your inhibitors go down when you're really tired. And I was really tired, and I asked a question that I wouldn't normally have asked. And I said, Oscar, I'm struggling. I'm wondering how do you keep hopeful? Because I struggle with hopelessness, and I'm looking around, and Jose got picked up and he's incarcerated, and Daisy got tortured, and Alberto got killed, and I don't know what your life expectancy is like, and I just wonder, like, how do you keep going? Why aren't you in despair? If this was in North America, I think we'd all be in despair. And he thought for a long time, and then he said, I've never thought about giving up. I thought over, like, even that you have never thought about giving up is incredible to me. And then he thought again, just sort of to humor me. And then he said, Karen, la desesperanza es el lujo del primer mundo, which means despair is a first world luxury. And despair is a first world luxury. And that is such a powerful statement, right? That only those of us with the, quote, first world privilege of not being engaged in the issues have the luxury of giving up. But if you're engaged in the issues, either physically or emotionally or mentally, or walking alongside people, or if it is your life, you don't have the luxury of that despair.
Thank you, Karen. I think that's a very powerful sentiment. And I do too come back. I mean, I've witnessed lots of families in Palestine lose their land this time, expansion of settlements and so on. But you look at them and they become stronger, and you ask them, as they collect their hearts after being shattered in so many pieces, what keeps you on your land? What keeps you rooted? And they look at the sun and the sky and the sage and the soil, and they say all of those things combined. Here, trying to put all that in words, it's very hard.
Yeah.
And so to bring us back to the people,
Yeah, because I didn't answer your question.
Yeah, no, it's fine. No,
I got sidetracked.
I think they're all beautiful stories.
But you did ask me about sort of what does it mean in terms of Indigenous anti-colonial struggles here, right? And I think that's a really important question. A couple of things come to mind for me. I think that, and it's a bit unfortunate, but I think it's true, that sometimes it's easier for people to see issues of injustice in which they have a more privileged role when it's somewhere else, right? And then they can bring it back to themselves. Right now we're all of us in Canada watching what's going on in the States and thinking, oh, this is terrible. And it is terrible. But there are also things here that are terrible. And we kind of sometimes use that to get ourselves off the hook. But sometimes we can also, as educators, we can use that as a way to open a door. And so, for example, for years, I would teach using textbook of Rigoberta Menchú, who's an Indigenous activist in Guatemala, Nobel Prize winner. And I would use that in my intro conflict resolution studies class so that her story, because her book is the story of her life, so that her story, then we can say, oh, and what are the parallels here? What are the stories here? Because I'm part of the generation, as someone in my mid-60s, I'm part of the generation of people that were raised in Canada who did not hear Indigenous stories, right? As a white kid growing up in a white neighborhood, I went to school at a time when we heard the stories of, that were very offensive about indigeneity and Indigenous peoples and Indigenous history, and their history was occluded. And I didn't hear about residential schools till I was in my late 20s, which is appalling. And I think that's not surprising for my generation. So I am very aware that one of the things that will be a life journey for me is continuing to learn about the actual history that's going on here in so-called Canada and the oppression of Indigenous people. And one of the ways that I learn best is through stories.
Mm-hmm.
I do not remember facts and figures. I do not remember numbers. Some people do. I don't. I remember through story. I remember through emotion. I remember through what moves my heart. And stories, as you know, get under our skin. They get past our defenses and move us in a way that I think for many of us, facts, figures, numbers don't move us in the same way.
Mm-hmm. In the Palestinian world, the Palestinian poet Mahmoud Darwish has a very famous poem. It starts with نحن ونحن نحب الحياة, which means we too love life if we are able to, right? And I think you talking about all of those stories you're sharing reminded me of that line. And so to bring us to on this road together, you work a lot with communities that have been harmed.
Mm-hmm.
How do stories and storytelling then become a practice of healing for them? Mm-hmm. Like if you can think of a story or are able to share a moment where people you've worked with, whether in Canada or outside of Canada, how do those individuals or communities navigate or navigated harm, continue to navigate harm, and of course within that highlight their resiliency and agency using stories? My family talks about story as practice. It's not something you just do once, or it's always part of what we do every day. And recently I've heard the most beautiful thing in terms of resistance is to hold on to your humanity. That's the biggest thing. That's a story in itself. So do you think of others or people that come to mind, or communities that you've eaten with, mm-hmm. that showed you humanity?
Mm-hmm. So many communities. It's a bit hard to choose the stories. But I think one that comes to mind for me right now, because I'm so deeply involved in transformative justice work and looking at our Canadian carceral system, I had the very big honor of teaching a Walls to Bridges course in 2019. Walls to Bridges teaches university courses inside prisons and jails to a mix of people who are currently inside or incarcerated and people who are outside currently. And outside folks come to the prison or the jail, and we have a class together. And it's a university course, and everyone that passes gets a university credit at the end of it. And it was a very powerful experience to bring these two groups together. Both groups were absolutely terrified on the first day. The people who were outside students were terrified because they were going into a carceral system. And as the people who were inside said, they're all scared of us because they're afraid that we're going to harm them, right? They're afraid that we're dangerous. Meanwhile, the people inside were really scared of the outside students because they were afraid that the outside students would come in and be judgy, right? And biased and hold up these stigmas and stereotypes and be unkind. So bringing those two groups together and then walking with those two groups, and our course was in restorative justice, which was also fascinating to do a restorative justice course inside a carceral institution. A little bit of irony there. And some of the moments that I remember from that course, I remember one of the women who was incarcerated when we had our closing graduation ceremony from the course. And she was able to, everyone was able to bring in a guest. And she brought in her son, who was about 13. And her son was struggling in school. And one of the things she said, we had a circle, one of the elders led us in a circle. And one of the things she said in the circle was, I've been so worried for my son because he's struggling in school, and being inside, there's so little I can do to support him. But he's seeing me graduate from this course, and this is a way that I support him. Or I think about one of the students who talked about how in restorative justice, we think about in a non vindictive way, we think about what's the harm that you've caused, because we've all caused harm, right? Everybody, the people who are outside students, people inside, everybody has caused harm at some point. And so the invitation to think about that. And one woman said that it was the first time that she had thought about the harm that she had inflicted on people through her crime. The first time that she had seen it from their perspective. And she could do that because she was in a group that cared about her. And that gave her the footing then to be able to look at this harm that she committed to someone, because it wasn't, she didn't have to go to a place of I'm a terrible person. She could be loved by this group and then look at, oh, that action I did was problematic. And then the other person that I think about is Lisa Bowden, who I've very much enjoyed collaborating with since her release from incarceration. We've been able to do a number of projects together. And we put together a series of videos of Lisa talking about why she ended up incarcerated. And she has this very powerful story of having, first of all, been incarcerated at Headingley in a very retributive setting, and then being released and going right back to doing what she'd done before and getting reincarcerated, this time knowing she was going to serve federal time. We met when she was waiting for her sentence. She knew she was going to go on and do federal time. And that's when she took the restorative justice course. And it led her to advocate to be able to go to a healing lodge, because she started to realize that she needed to look at what were the roots. Why did she end up doing the things she did? Because that's the story, right? The story is, why do people commit the harm? What was going on in their lives? What needed to be going on in their lives? And so by being able to tell her story, she was able to start looking at and healing those roots. And at the Healing Lodge, she got a lot of support for being able to do that. Now she's out. And one of the ways that she processes the PTSD that she had before incarceration, that was compounded by the experiences of incarceration in a federal and provincial jail. One of the ways she processes that is by telling her story, by educating people. And she was just recently at one of my university classes, and she was teaching us beading, because for Lisa, beading is healing. And so, a class of 30 people, many of whom were not aware that they had ever met people that were incarcerated, and getting this warm and caring and enthusiastic teacher of beading, helping them bead and telling stories and laughing with them and caring about them, and just smashing the stigmas around what people who are incarcerated are like. And also Lisa getting this wonderful, empowering experience of being able to tell her story, and tell her story in her own voice, in her own way, tell what parts of the story she wants to, not the other parts, and have agency over that. And so many people that are incarcerated, just like, as you know, so many people who are, quote, marginalized in a variety of ways, don't get agency over their story, right? So to get agency over it, to get the chance to tell your story in the way you want to whom you want to, that's an incredibly empowering and healing thing.
Yeah, thank you, Karen. I feel while you're telling those stories, I feel like I'm healing with you. I'm healing through those stories, and I could picture your guest speaker beading in your class, and I could picture people that you've talked about telling their stories with agency and pride. The last question we have, Karen, is you've been doing this for a long time. There is one advice for us to do, for people who are listening, to take an account, to do this work and take care of yourself. What should we do? What should we consider? I do a lot of work on Palestine, and it's not an easy thing to carry. And there are many ups and downs. And so I've been trying to reflect on, how do I continue this work and bring people into it without risking burnout?
Well, first of all, I am not the best example of this. I don't do self-care nearly as well as I should. And that's, I guess I guess I'm going to keep learning all my life, and learning is being alive. And so if I learn this eventually, that would be good. But self-care is not my strong suit. What I will say, though, that I do know, and this I do well, is the incredible importance of community. You can't do this work on your own. It is the work that you need to do with people that you walk alongside with, because there will be days when you absolutely have nothing in you, and you need to be able to reach out to other people And most of all, you need to know that other people are doing this alongside you. I think, there's so many issues to work on, and it's impossible to work on them all as one person. And I have to trust that there are so many other people walking alongside me in this struggle, and that they're carrying their pieces. And my job is just to carry the pieces that I can carry and carry them well as I can. And so that means both community in the large sense, the community people that I don't know, right? The people that are right now protesting in Minneapolis, right? And that they are in the same walk that I'm in, and I don't know them, but I know that they're in this walk with me, and they need to know that, trust that I'm in the walk with them. And there's so many people around the world like that, right?
Mhm.
So part of it's that trusting that larger community, whether it's U.S., Sudan, Palestine, people walking,
Together.
people believing in, people working for justice. And then the other is the specific individuals. You got to have friends doing this. As Adine, there's been so many times over the last few years when I think you and I have connected, uh, even just for a text or a short message, that has certainly for me helped me be able to keep going. Um, and I don't know that I could do that if I didn't have people like you and some other folks in my life that were um, touchstones for me in that way.
Thank you, Karen, for all of your wisdom. Thank you for your healing. Thank you for reminding us that stories ground us, for reminding us that stories begin in community and they are in community. And to be in community is to re-story and to be in story. Folks, thank you for being with us today through this conversation. I hope you are doing well. If you have a story you want to share through the Unbounded Stories, please reach out. Until next story, this is Azadeen. Shukran.